Edward H. Rulloff's story begins in the quiet farming communities of upstate New York, a place of modest ambitions and simpler lives. But from the beginning, Edward was never destined for simplicity. Born in 1819 in the small town of Elmira, he quickly demonstrated an intellect that seemed to place him apart from his peers. While most boys in the countryside were expected to learn enough reading and arithmetic to manage a farm or a trade, Edward's appetite for knowledge was insatiable. By the time he was in his early teens, he was reading Latin texts, mastering Greek, and astonishing anyone who encountered him with his ability to absorb languages with preternatural ease. He wasn't merely bright. He was brilliant, the kind of intellect that should have propelled him to the lecture halls of Harvard or the cultural salons of New York City. But there was another side to Edward, one that lurked in the shadows of his brilliance. From an early age, those closest to him remarked on his arrogance, his coldness, and his lack of empathy. He believed himself superior to those around him, sneering at the ignorance of neighbors and even belittling teachers who could not keep up with his mind. That pride, coupled with an increasingly manipulative streak, would become the cornerstone of a double life. One of a man who could dazzle with words and knowledge, while plotting in secret to bend others to his will and feed darker appetites. In the 1830s and 1840s, America still believed in self-made men, in the power of genius to rise above one's circumstances. Edward embraced that idea, but twisted it into something sinister. He believed his brilliance placed him above morality itself. By the time he reached his early 20s, he had already formed a philosophy that knowledge was not only power, but justification. If he could outthink the world, why should he not also outmaneuver its laws? It was the seed of a dangerous conviction that he was not bound by the same rules as other men. In 1843, Edward married Harriet Shutt, a young woman of charm and promise from Dryden, New York. To neighbors, the union seemed a respectable match, though those who knew Harriet more intimately whispered that she seemed uneasy, as though the brilliance of her husband carried with it a shadow she could not fully name. Harriet gave birth to their daughter, Priscilla, and for a fleeting moment, it looked as though Edward's life might settle into a conventional rhythm. The scholar, the husband, the father. But in 1844, everything shattered. Harriet and the infant suddenly disappeared. Edward told neighbors and in-laws that Harriet had left him, had gone away in disgrace or anger, depending on who asked. But suspicion lingered. Harriet was devoted to her child and to her family. Her sudden departure without contact seemed unthinkable. Edward's behavior during this time only deepened the unease. He carried himself with his usual intellectual arrogance, dismissing questions and belittling concerns. But behind the facade, it became increasingly clear that he had committed an unthinkable crime. To this day, the bodies of Harriet and little Priscilla have never been found. Rumors spread that Edward had killed them both in a fit of anger, perhaps spurred by domestic conflict, perhaps because he saw them as impediments to his ambitions. In rural New York, whispers of murder could not easily be substantiated without proof, but the air around Edward grew thick with suspicion. His in-laws pressed for answers, but Edward remained evasive, alternating between charm and intimidation. The town's lawmen tried to act, but with no bodies, no witnesses, and no confession, justice could not be secured. Edward slipped away, leaving behind a grieving family and a cloud of unanswered questions. This moment marked the first true unveiling of the duality that defined him. The scholar who dreamed of writing a masterwork on philology, and the killer who could coldly erase his own wife and child, as if they were footnotes in his grand design. He would never admit guilt for this crime, but the silence of Harriet and Priscilla spoke louder than any confession. It was the beginning of a trail of destruction that would stretch across decades. After Harriet's disappearance, Edward's life became a study in contrasts, a balancing act between dazzling intellectual pursuits and darker, criminal enterprises. He drifted from town to town, securing positions as a teacher, tutor, and lecturer. In one place, he would be celebrated as a gifted linguist, teaching students with a brilliance that few could rival. In another, he would be viewed with suspicion, rumors of his wife's mysterious disappearance following him like a shadow. But Edward was skilled at reinvention. He used aliases, fabricated stories of his past, and leveraged his charm to gain trust. At times, he even presented himself as a man of science, a thinker who would one day revolutionize the study of language with his theories. Behind the mask, however, Edward was always scheming. He supplemented his academic work with theft, burglary, and manipulation. He gravitated toward unsavory companions, men who could assist in robberies and who marveled at Edward's ability to plan crimes with the precision of a military strategist. For Edward, crime was not merely necessity, but a kind of intellectual exercise, a test of his superiority over others. Yet even as he mingled with criminals, he remained obsessed with his academic pursuits, filling notebooks with linguistic theories and sketches for a magnum opus that he believed would secure his immortality. It was as if he lived two lives simultaneously, one in the library, one in the shadows. To outsiders, Edward seemed like an enigma, the cultured scholar who quoted Greek philosophers, yet also the drifter whose name was whispered in connection with burglary rings. And always, the question of Harriet lingered. Families in every town heard the story eventually. The brilliant man whose wife and child had vanished without a trace. He brushed it off with arrogance, convincing some, unnerving others. But he never escaped the suspicion. Over time, his wanderings grew increasingly desperate. Arrests for petty crimes accumulated. Short prison sentences punctuated his travels. Yet each time he emerged, he returned to his manuscripts, convinced that genius was his true destiny, that history would remember him not for the blood he had spilled, but for the brilliance of his mind. This illusion, that his intellectual legacy would outshine his sins, would drive him deeper into both scholarship and crime, until the two became inseparably entwined. Edward Rulloff's life in the late 1840s and 1850s was defined by a rhythm of crime, arrest, and intellectual labor behind bars. He could never quite resist the lure of theft, burglary, and schemes to acquire money or books. Yet every arrest seemed to provide him with more time to devote to scholarship, to prison guards and fellow inmates. Edward appeared unlike any other criminal. He spent his days not in idle talk or gambling, but in intense study. He would scratch linguistic theories into scraps of paper, draft notes for his projected masterpiece on philology, and boast of the revelations he alone had uncovered about the origins of language. Edward claimed he was developing a theory that all languages shared a single root, a discovery he believed would secure his immortality in the world of science. But prison also hardened him. He grew more cunning, more manipulative, more adept at playing the roles he needed to survive. Sometimes he was the model inmate, quoting scripture or dazzling officials with learned conversation. Other times, he was the calculating criminal, bribing, intimidating, or deceiving others to gain advantage. His arrogance remained his constant companion. He scoffed at fellow prisoners, dismissing them as dullards, and told wardens that he was no mere thief, but a misunderstood genius temporarily caught in unfortunate circumstances. Each release from prison marked a return to the cycle. He would attempt a fresh start, sometimes taking work as a schoolteacher or tutor, only to slide back into schemes that required breaking the law. By the late 1850s, he was known in multiple towns not only as an eccentric scholar, but also as a figure of suspicion, forever connected to whispered crimes. Yet Edward nurtured a belief that destiny was on his side. He told confidants that great men of science and literature were often persecuted in their lifetimes, but history remembered their brilliance. In his mind, prison sentences were temporary setbacks on the path to greatness. What he refused to acknowledge was the mounting evidence of a darker truth, that every step deeper in a crime pulled him further from redemption and closer to ruin. By the 1860s, Edward had aligned himself with a group of criminals who would help him carry out one of the most audacious robberies in the history of upstate New York. Among his closest accomplices were Albert Jarvis and William Dexter, men of lesser intellect but willing hands. Edward provided the brains, mapping out strategies, planning entry routes and orchestrating details with the precision of a general. His target was often not money alone, but also books and materials that might further his studies, a bizarre mix of scholarship and crime. But his ambition grew larger. In 1870, Edward, Jarvis, and Dexter set their sights on a dry goods store in Ithaca. It was not merely about stealing merchandise. Edward envisioned a haul that would fund the completion and eventual publication of his linguistic magnum opus. The robbery was meticulously planned, but like so many of Edward's schemes, it descended into disaster. On the night of the burglary, as the men attempted to carry out their plan, they were discovered by a store clerk named Frederick Merrick. He had crossed fully into bloodshed, sacrificing human life for the sake of his dreams. Word spread quickly, and the community of Ithaca was thrown into terror. The scholar thief, long whispered about in suspicion, was now a confirmed murderer. The local press seized on the sensational case. The man who quoted Plato and discoursed on the roots of language was also the man who bludgeoned a store clerk to death in cold blood. For Edward, capture soon followed. He and his accomplices were arrested, and while some hoped he might finally face justice not only for the murder but also for the long shadow of Harriet and Priscilla's disappearance, Edward clung stubbornly to his arrogance. Even in custody, he spoke less of guilt and more of misunderstood genius, insisting that his real crime was being unrecognized in his lifetime. Yet the death of Frederick Merrick ensured that Edward could not talk his way free. He had sealed his fate with blood. Edward's trial for the murder of Frederick Merrick was one of the most sensational events in 19th century New York. Courtrooms overflowed with spectators, and newspapers sent reporters from across the region to cover the strange story of the criminal intellectual. The prosecution painted him as a calculating killer, a man whose brilliance made him not admirable but all the more dangerous. They reminded the jury of his long history of crime, of the vanished wife and child whose fate remained unresolved, and of the arrogance with which he had lived above the law. The defense, meanwhile, sought to portray him as a man of genius whose mind operated on a different plane, someone more deserving of a place in academia than in a prison cell. Some even suggested that his brilliance bordered on madness, that he should be pitied rather than punished. But the jury was not swayed. They saw not a misunderstood scholar, but a man who had crossed the ultimate line by killing an innocent clerk in pursuit of his ambitions. The verdict was guilty, sentenced to death. Edward maintained his intellectual pretensions to the very end. While awaiting execution, he continued working feverishly on his manuscript, convinced that posterity would vindicate him. He corresponded with professors, argued about linguistic theory, and even gained a small circle of admirers who were fascinated by his peculiar combination of brilliance and brutality. To the wider public, however, he became known as the Genius Killer. His hanging in 1871 drew enormous crowds, a grim spectacle that symbolized both justice served and the unsettling fascination society held for men who combine intellect with evil. After his execution, doctors dissected his brain, hoping to find physical evidence of his supposed genius. The specimen was preserved and studied, becoming one of the most infamous brains in medical history. Yet in the end, Edward's dream of being remembered as a towering intellect was overshadowed by his reality, a killer whose brilliance only deepened the horror of his crimes. His legacy remains a chilling reminder that intelligence without morality can lead not to enlightenment, but to destruction. In the weeks and months following his conviction, Edward Rulloff's existence became a strange paradox. He was a condemned man living under the shadow of the gallows, and yet he behaved as though he were still a scholar awaiting his next lecture. His cell became cluttered with books, scraps of notes, and drafts of his great linguistic work. Guards described the sight as bizarre. Here was a man sentenced to die, yet he spent his hours furiously debating etymologies, correcting the syntax of fellow inmates, and writing letters to professors across the country. Edward refused to acknowledge the finality of his fate. Instead, he spoke with the calm certainty of someone who believed that history itself would intervene. To visitors, he presented himself not as a criminal, but as a martyr of science. He claimed that his death would be a tragedy for humanity, that a lifetime of discoveries would be buried with him if society failed to recognize his genius. Journalists who came to interview him were struck by his composure. He quoted philosophers with ease, discussed linguistic theory in astonishing detail, and even criticized the court for being composed of men too common-minded to understand the value of his work. Yet beneath the intellectual mask, cracks showed. At night, when the prison was quiet, Edward's arrogance gave way to brooding silences. Some guards reported hearing him muttering to himself, sometimes calling out Harriet's name, as if haunted by the wife whose disappearance remained an unsolved wound. Others said he would pace for hours, clenching his fists and whispering fragments of words, as if rehearsing both arguments for his innocence and pleas for a legacy that would outlast the hangman's noose. His death sentence became a theater of contradictions. The public saw a murderer awaiting punishment, but Edward envisioned himself as a scholar whose greatness had been obscured by petty moral judgment. It was this tension that fascinated the nation. The genius who refused to die as anything less than a man of science. On the morning of May 18, 1871, the town of Binghamton, New York, was electric with anticipation. Word had spread that Edward Rulloff, the genius killer, was to be hanged, and thousands flocked to witness the grim spectacle. Public executions were already becoming rare by the 1870s, but this case drew unparalleled attention because of who Edward was. For some, it was justice finally delivered for a murderer who had escaped accountability for too long. For others, it was an event tinged with unease. Society was about to extinguish a mind that, however twisted, possessed undeniable brilliance. Edward dressed carefully that morning, as though preparing to give a lecture rather than meet his death. He maintained an air of defiance, telling those around him that posterity would vindicate him. When led to the gallows, he walked with a scholar's poise, calm and deliberate. Crowds strained to hear his final words, expecting either a confession or a profound statement. Instead, Edward spoke with measured arrogance, declaring that his theories would one day revolutionize the study of language and that his death would not silence the truth he had discovered. The execution itself was swift but brutal. The trapdoor fell, the rope snapped tight, and the crowd gasped as the brilliant murderer swung lifeless. For many, it was a moment of closure, the long saga of crime and intellect finally meeting its inevitable end. Yet for others, it was a moment of unsettling reflection. Had society executed a man who, despite his crimes, might have contributed something remarkable to human knowledge? Newspapers captured this tension, printing lurid headlines about the hanging while also devoting columns to speculation about what his unfinished work might have revealed. The spectacle of Edward's death was more than punishment. It was a cultural moment, a collision between morality, justice, and the intoxicating danger of genius unmoored from conscience. In the aftermath of his execution, Edward Rulloff's body was handed over to medical authorities. Scientists and physicians, eager to unlock the secrets of his extraordinary mind, dissected his brain in search of anomalies. It was said to be one of the largest brains ever recorded, weighing more than the average by several ounces. To the medical community of the 19th century, this became proof that genius could indeed be measured in physical form. His brain was preserved, displayed, and studied for decades, a grim relic of the intersection between brilliance and crime. Meanwhile, his manuscripts and linguistic notes were scattered, partially lost, partially archived. Some scholars later examined his theories and found them intriguing but ultimately unconvincing, a mixture of genuine insight and wild speculation. Others dismissed him outright as a fraud who cloaked his crimes in intellectual posturing. Yet the fascination with Edward Rulloff never truly faded. He remained a figure who embodied the unsettling idea that intelligence does not guarantee morality. Writers, criminologists, and historians have continued to study his life, not because his linguistic work endured, but because his existence posed troubling questions. How could a man capable of such intellectual achievement also commit acts of such cruelty? Was his genius warped by criminality, or was his criminality enabled by his genius? In time, Edward's name became less associated with the promise of scholarship and more with the chilling allure of the criminal mastermind. He became a case study in psychology, criminology, and the philosophy of morality. The preserved brain, the unfinished manuscripts, the lingering mystery of Harriet and Priscilla's disappearance, all combined to form a legacy steeped in both horror and intrigue. Edward Rulloff never achieved the fame he desired as a linguist, but in a darker way, he achieved immortality. He became the archetype of the genius killer, remembered not for enlightening humanity, but for proving how dangerous brilliance can become when it is stripped of empathy and bound to arrogance. His life endures as a warning that intellect without conscience is a force as destructive as any weapon.